Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the second lecture that I'm doing anyway, for STEM for Tomorrow. I am going to set up my share screen. Okay, biology and the environment. A quick refresher for anyone who was not able to attend yesterday's. I talked a lot about the ecosystem and classifications. I first talked about the different domains and kingdoms in life in general and how scientists like to classify and group different species and why they like to do that. I then went from there and talked about biomes and talked about how we get from a cell all the way to an organism and then an organism all the way to a biome, talking about population, community, ecosystem. I also briefly talked about abiotic and biotic factors, abiotic being non living factors and biotic being living factors. I also talked about cooperation and competition within the animal kingdom and the different types of relationships that scientists like to categorize. Speaking of symbiotic relationships, which we have mutualism, where both species benefit, commensalism, one species benefits, one has no effect, and parasiticism, where one benefits, one suffers. So that's a lot of basis for a lot of biology topics and a lot of ecology, which is a branch of biology that talks about the relationships within the ecosystem and animals' relationships to each other. Now that we have a basis for that, I wanted to do a quick refresher on three cycles. You will probably be familiar with one of them, the water cycle, but then I also wanted to talk about the nitrogen and carbon cycles and why they are so important. After that, I'll take a quick question break for anyone who has questions on those. And then I want to move into environmental problems because the whole point of all of these bases in biology is for everyone to have a little bit of background in some of the environmental problems. So I'm going to give a synopsis of some of the big environmental problems and then some ideas for science fair projects or ideas for ways that scientists are looking to combat it. So if you're interested in those types of science fair projects, I think it'll be really interesting. Okay, so let's get into it. First, we have the water cycle. I'm sure most of you know this one. The most basic one you will see on your right, which is we have evaporation, which is water in lakes and streams in the ocean, is exposed to heat and it changes forms because there's three forms of matter: solid, liquid, gas, and plasma later on. But yeah, it goes from a liquid to a gas when heat is applied. So then the water droplets go up into the sky and they condense through a process called condensation because up in the sky it is very cold. So they will go back into kind of a liquid gas form and form clouds. Once more and more water gets into these clouds, they get heavy enough that this water needs to be let out through precipitation, and the water runs to the ground and runs off back into the rivers and to the lakes and to the oceans, where it will then evaporate again. On the left is a more complex version of that, and the big thing that you just need to recognize that's added into that is something called transpiration. Can't speak, which is dew from plants. Plants, a byproduct a lot of times from photosynthesis. They will have water on their plants, on their leaves. A lot of times in the mornings, dew forms as well. And all of this water, if it doesn't go into the plants, it also gets evaporated. So it's the same thing as evaporation. Heat is applied to water, which then gets changed into a gas. It just happens with plants. So that's called transpiration. Another thing is called sublimation. It's where the mountains are, if you can see in the photo. And this is where ice, which is a solid, will then become a gas. You'll learn in chemistry the different form changes and their names. When a solid becomes a gas, there's so much heat is applied that it goes from a solid to a gas. That's called sublimation. Sublimation. And then obviously we have precipitation. And really, on the left, you see the more complex ways that it gets back into the oceans through a lot of different surface runoff and groundwater discharge. Basically, water can sometimes heat anytime it's going downhill, and it can seep into the ground, particularly at pockets that are lower than hills because gravity will bring the water down. Eventually, it'll end up in the rivers and the oceans, but that's just a more complex way to look at it. Then we have the nitrogen cycle. This is very much a dumbed down version of the nitrogen cycle because the full nitrogen cycle gets very complex. Well, basically, what you have to understand is nitrogen is all around us. It makes up something like 75% of the atmosphere. Now, we need nitrogen for us as humans, but it's not very good to breathe in a ton of nitrogen, breathe in pure nitrogen. That's not really safe for us. That's why a lot of different planets' atmospheres don't work for us, is because of the too much nitrogen that we couldn't inhale, and other reasons, but it's one of the reasons. So this nitrogen gets in our food. So the way it gets there is it's in the atmosphere, and it gets usually into the clouds, which we already mentioned is a part of the water cycle when it condenses. A lot of times when it rains down, water has a little bit of nitrogen in it. Sometimes it just falls with the nitrogen. Sometimes it just falls with the water droplets. Sometimes it's a little bit mixed in with the water droplets, but it comes down in precipitation. And then it gets into the ground and mixes with the roots of plants in a process called fixation. And what this does is the nitrogen reacts with the plant roots in a chemical reaction that the plant roots turn this very pure form of nitrogen into a more easier to use version of it. So this process is called nitrogen fixation, and that's what you see at the little 2. Then it goes into the 3. Because of this easier to use nitrogen in the plant roots, the plants start to produce proteins and DNAs in these plants. That's step 3. And step 4, these plants and vegetation that now have this nitrogen is eaten by animals, and this example, cows. The cows then to start to produce these same proteins and DNAs. When cows poop, and we have waste products, some of this nitrogen escapes the poop and goes through a process called denitrification, which just means it floats back up into the atmosphere to then be a part of the clouds and starts the cycle all over again. Some of the nitrogen from the poop goes back into the soil, though, and starts reacting with the plants again in nitrogen fixation. So it kind of goes back to step 2. Also, when cows die or animals die, the same thing happens. Part of the nitrogen goes through the process called denitrification, and it goes back up into the atmosphere. Part of it goes into the soil to work with the plant roots in that process, nitrogen fixation, but part of it stays within the animal. So when you eat meat, when you eat anything with animals, you're tasting a little bit of nitrogen, which is the nitrogen we need. You can also sometimes get this in plants as well because it's in the plant roots, but that's kind of how we get a little bit of nitrogen inside us, just the amount that we need to survive. So that is the nitrogen cycle. A bit of a dumbed down version of it. It gets a little bit more complex, but that's kind of the bare foundations you need to know. Then we have the carbon cycle. So everything in the carbon cycle really comes down to photosynthesis and how photosynthesis works. So you'll learn this in biology and chemistry as well. The chemical reaction for photosynthesis. In chemical reactions, there is 2 sides to the equation. There is the first side takes reactants. And that is anything that reacts together in the chemical reaction. And then usually there's an arrow, and then we have the products, what comes out of the chemical reaction. So for photosynthesis, the reactants is sunlight, so solar energy, carbon dioxide, and water. And this all reacts together to make the products glucose, which is food for plants, and oxygen. So this is very important. So sunlight in a combination of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is taken by trees, who then breathe out oxygen for us to breathe in. What happens is this carbon dioxide from this reaction then goes into the plant's roots and then gets infused within the soil. This carbon dioxide in the soil also works together with cow or animal poop, which also, some of animal poop has carbon, which then goes within the soil. So this is what makes up fossil fuels. The carbon from decaying animals, from poop, and from roots in the soil from trees make up fossil fuels. Now, fossil fuels is a source of energy for us, and we burn these fossil fuels in factories to get energy. But a byproduct of us burning these fossil fuels is that this carbon dioxide gets put back out into the atmosphere, which then will get sucked up by trees, which gives you a cycle. Another part of the cycle is, if you look into the center of all of these circles, is you see breathing animals and the gas exchange of plants. Now, how I talked about the chemical formula for photosynthesis, there's another really, really important chemical formula that you'll learn a lot in biology and a little bit in chemistry too, which is called cellular respiration. And this is the chemical reaction that happens every time we breathe. So the reactants in breathing is glucose and oxygen. And the products are carbon dioxide and water. If you think back to when I talked about photosynthesis, it's the same elements and compounds. The reactants and products of photosynthesis are switched, and that's what makes up cellular respiration. So we breathe out carbon dioxide, and trees or plants, in a way, breathe out oxygen. So there's a gas exchange going on there. That's just very important to know. Both of those chemical formulas are really staples for biology and how a lot of things work. So, yeah. So why are cycles important? They're important because they make us aware of how different elements flow through the earth. It's also very interesting that they all flow in these cycles because it makes them all reusable. We're not going to run out of water. We're not going to run out of carbon dioxide or nitrogen because they're constantly being put back into the atmosphere, constantly cycling through. The thing is, specifically focusing on the carbon cycle, we are doing the factories and the trees balance each other out because the trees take the carbon dioxide we're putting in the atmosphere. But recently, we've been killing off too many trees and cutting too many trees and having too many factories. When this gets out of balance, we're putting too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but we don't have enough trees to take this carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So it's knowledge of the cycles that helps us understand why that's even happening and why that's leading to further problems. So I'm going to stop real quickly to see if anyone has questions on these topics before I move into other environmental problems. When we eat plants such as fruits on the plants, do we eat nitrogen? Yes, you're not eating any unsafe levels, but there's a little tiny percentage of nitrogen in almost everything we eat, which is just the nitrogen that helps our body function and helps our body with other sources. So There's higher nitrogen levels in like animals, but there is still a little bit of nitrogen in plants. Hope that answers your question. Are there any cycles in nature? If so, what are they? There's plenty of cycles in nature. Anything that is reusable has a cycle to it because otherwise it wouldn't be reusable. But the three fundamental ones that they're going to make you want to know is water, nitrogen, and carbon. Someone said it's just like radioactive bananas. It's radioactive at a safe level. I think that's very accurate. I'll wait 2 more minutes to see if there's any more questions. Okay, one last question here. Is there a rate of how fast of is there a rate of how fast water evaporates? I'm sure if you Google, there's probably a scientific number, but it's all dependent on heat. So in the summer, there's going to be more evaporation than there is in the winter. So heat accelerates the phase change. So more heat, the faster it'll happen. Okay, I think that was a good last question. So let's go back to sharing. Perfect. There we go. So climate change. This is a biggie. Everyone always wants to talk about it. So what is climate change? The Earth's average temperature is about 15 degrees Celsius, but it has been much higher and lower in the past. So there are natural fluctuations in the climate, but scientists generally are saying that temperatures are rising faster than they have in the past. This is linked to the greenhouse effect, which describes how the Earth's atmosphere traps some of the sun's energy. So, solar energy radiating back to space from the Earth's surface is absorbed by the greenhouse gases and re-emitted in all directions. This heats both the lower atmosphere and the surface of the planet. Science believe we are also adding to that natural greenhouse effect with gases released from industry and agriculture, which are trapping more energy and increasing the temperature. So, greenhouse gases are the one with the greatest impact is water vapor and carbon dioxide. Water vapor isn't that harmful because it only remains in the atmosphere for a couple of days. So if there's a lot in the atmosphere that is causing really warm, muggy days, this is a lot of times related to weather and why we have really muggy days, really humid days, and that's because there's a lot of water vapor in the atmosphere. But it never stays long because then eventually it rains. The more dangerous of the two is carbon dioxide because, like I said earlier, we have so many factories, but we don't have enough trees, which are taking the carbon dioxide. So more and more carbon dioxide is getting trapped in this atmosphere that it's causing this big greenhouse effect, which is raising the temperature of the earth. Most man-made emissions of CO2 come from burning fossil fuels, like I mentioned with the carbon cycle. When carbon-absorbing forests are cut down and left to rot, that stored carbon, can't speak, is released, contributing to global warming. Talking some statistics for real quickly, since the Industrial Revolution, CO2 levels have risen more than 30%. The concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is higher than at any time in the last 800,000 years. So this is causing massive problems for all types of animals and species because animals haven't adapted to these warmer temperatures. So some project ideas we can do, and what can you do with this information? A good way to do this is find a way to measure the timeline for climate change. If you're like, well, climate change is such a big issue, how am I going to come up with a science experiment to battle it? A good way is just to find ways to measure the timeline for climate change. What numbers are we looking at? How long do we have to fix this problem before it becomes irreversible? My science fair project that I took all the way to regionals was I used Daphnia, which I mentioned yesterday in the lecture. It's a protista that you can measure their heartbeat through a microscope. I used that to view their cardiac health rate, and I tested slight differences in water temperatures, which were about the climate change numbers we were talking about. I saw that they were able to adapt, Daphnia specifically were able to adapt a little bit better to colder temperatures, but with warmer temperatures, it caused really bad spikes in their heart rate and really shortened their lifespan, which caused me to collect all this data and come up with a timeline of the numbers we're speaking for climate change right now. I predicted that in 75 years, we will see a collapse in the freshwater ecosystem because Daphnia is such a keystone part of the ecosystem. And like I mentioned yesterday with food chains, once you have something that's so low on the food chain that you have a significant decrease in populations, you're going to see decreases everywhere in population because everything that eats that is going to have a decrease in population. And then everything that eats Daphnia is going to have a decrease in population. So again, project ideas is just ways to measure it. Another way is ways to reduce our CO2. You can theorize, is there ways to gain energy other than fossil fuels? Yes, there is, but is there ways we could implement it in a better way? A lot of people's problem with solar energy is that it's very costly and it's very hard to put in for a lot of places. You also see CO2 with a lot of cars. Why aren't electric cars being more prevalent? These aren't always the most testable theories you can do, but I'm just spitballing some things of ideas you can see. Any of the topics that I'm talking about right now, if you listen and you're like, oh, I have a project idea, I have a way that we could reduce this, then go for it. It's your idea, obviously. These are just ways to spark a conversation about possible ideas and such. So moving on. Pollution. I have a lot to say on this topic. So the first one is air pollution. Air pollution is caused by these factories. All air pollutants cause some damage to living creatures and the environment. Different types of pollutants cause different types of harm. One type of pollutant is called particulates. Particulates reduce visibility. In the Western United States, people can now ordinarily see only about 60 to 90 miles, which is 1/2 to 2/3 of the natural range you can see when there's no pollution. Particulates reduce the amount of sunshine that reaches the ground, which may reduce photosynthesis because photosynthesis is completely based on sunlight, like I was saying earlier. Since particulates form the nucleus for raindrops, snowflakes, or other forms of participation, participation may increase when we have all these particulates, or when particulates are high. And this isn't a very good thing. You might think more rainfall is good, but if you have this harmful chemical in a lot of our precipitation that causes more rain, you're going to see acid rain, which I'm going to talk about later, which is very much not good and causes a lot of damage. By reducing sunshine, particulates can also alter air temperature and can also add on to climate change. Another one is ozone. There's certain chemicals that are damaging our ozone. The ozone is a layer that protects us from a lot of the really harsh rays of the sun, and we've been seeing rapid ozone depletion caused by these pollutants, which are poking holes in the ozone and allowing these really harmful rays from the sun to go all the way through. And this damages some plants. Since these effects accumulate, plants that live a long time show the most damage, which means trees are the most susceptible. If a forest contains ozone-sensitive trees, they might all die out, and these trees will eventually have to adapt so they are not as easily harmed by these sun rays. The thing is, adaptation can take thousands and thousands of years, and we're not really running on that type of timeline right now. Some crop plants show ozone damage, which obviously could cause problems in our food supply, because if we have a decrease in the amount of food that we're able to grow, then especially with the growing population right now, that's really going to affect our food supply. Another pollutant is oxide. Oxide air pollutants also damage the environment. It's a toxic orange-brown colored gas that gives air a distinctive orange color and an unpleasant odor. It also gets into the clouds and causes acid rain. It's the main one that actually causes acid rain, which is oxides. So lichen can get a lot of nutrients from the air, so they're good indicators of changes in the atmosphere. So damage to lichen is a really good indicator for the damage that there is in the air. So this is a really good project idea, is to test different harmful chemicals that you're still allowed to use on lichen, because they're a good indicator of different types of air pollutions. Other ways is when I went to the regional science fair, I saw a lot of people seeing if we have coming up with sprays and certain chemicals that could help build up the ozone layer or could help neutralize the chemicals in the air. With a lot of these air pollutants, everything in chemistry can be neutralized. The only problem is you'd have to do a lot of research in what are the negative effects of these chemicals, because anytime you're putting chemicals in the air, people really want to know what are negative side effects of that. So those are just some ideas. I think lichen is a really cool idea because obviously it's a good simulation for what is actually happening with air pollution, and you'd be able to do it pretty easily without having to go to a lab, which is always the goal, right? Whatever we can do without a lab is always nice. So now let's talk water pollution. Obviously, you've seen a lot of the things with turtles and plastics. First, we have surface water. Surface water is what covers 70% of the earth. It's what fills our oceans, lakes, rivers. Surface water from freshwater sources accounts for more than 60% of the water delivered to our homes. I'm sorry, I really can't talk today. So the EPA which is the Environmental Protection Agency, has set out to try to prevent this pollution in our drinking water, and has been met with some backlash because it puts a lot of regulations on different factories. And since factories make us money, anything that is a part of the economy, you're going to meet a lot of backlash. But a lot of the runoff and byproducts from factories can get into our water supply and poison it and really damage it for the animals that live there. On top of that, we're seeing a huge problem with just waste in general. Right now, we're really running out of space for certain landfills and other things. Mainly the problem that's happening is people are not throwing things away in the trash, and people aren't recycling. And anytime people are littering, when rain comes through, if you think back to the water cycle, when rain comes through, we have runoff, which runs into the lakes and the rivers and the oceans. Well, runoff also picks up any of these chemicals that might be just out in the open. It picks up plastics, trash, and it's bringing them out into the water, which is super, super damaging for the animals that live there. A big one that's happening is we're getting runoff from construction sites, and chemicals being used by certain construction sites mix and part of the runoff, which goes into the oceans. So what do we do about this problem? Because you can put limitations and put really strict littering laws in place, but overall, we need construction and we need factories in some part due to energy. But one way that I was thinking is using filtration devices. So yes, we're not really able to stop these getting into the water, but if we were able to filter these out at entrance points. So this is a really good project idea. You can try different filters that maybe could be set up in points of entry that we usually see in a lot of sewers that would cause this plastic to stop. It's also a really good idea for jobs. If we need more jobs, you can have a job be that people go through and clean out the plastic stuck there. Can everyone's mics be muted? Sorry, I'm hearing something in the background. Thank you. So anyway, that's a really good idea. If you want to find ways of filtration devices that could be implemented, it's a really good science fair project. And lastly, let's talk about waste pollution. So this kind of pollution is actually the degradation of the Earth's surface. There are two causes. It's mainly caused by the improper disposal of waste and the misuse of resources. Here are some examples of land pollution. We have litter on pretty much everywhere, oil spills, which I'll talk about later, illegal dumping in natural habitats. Some people with massive amounts of trash, somewhere to hide, will dump them where animals live. We have debris or damage caused from unstable practices, pesticides and other farming chemicals, which also can get picked up and run off, bringing it back to water pollution. We have garbage pollution, which is caused by the mismanagement of solid waste from humans and their activities. The effects of this type of pollution is the spread of harmful bacteria in the surroundings, as well as obnoxious odors, which will also end up as air pollution. The water will also get contaminated, which will transmit parasites and bacteria to humans. Beach pollution is waste like plastic bags, nets, or cigarette filters that are being thrown to the beach. This waste harms sea creatures and affects the marine environment. It also usually ends up in the water. It is often caused by irresponsible beach visitors who are littering and just leaving their waste everywhere. Then we have plastic pollution. Plastic pollution is hard and soft, non-degradable plastic that stays on the land for thousands of years or forever. Because pretty much scientists are having huge problems breaking down plastic. It will stay forever in the soil and harm the soil's health and composition. Plastic is like the evil of all evils. It really can't be broken down, and no matter what, it eventually, even if you recycle it, a part of plastic, every time you recycle it, ends up into nature because people don't consistently recycle plastic. So people then make more plastic. And then when you have more and more plastic that never can be destroyed, I think you get the problem here. Another problem is landfills. We only have so much space in the earth. We only have so much place in the earth to put our trash. And a lot of this isn't eventually ending up back in the water, back in nature. Also, not a lot of this trash will break down and help the soil. So what can we do? What are good science fair projects that could help this? One is a way to crush trash. Trash right now is taking up too much space. If we could find ways to crush trash using machines, this would be very, 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 very helpful. One negative, if you decide to do this project, is that would be building a machine, and a lot of experiments need something called an EDD, which is just an experimental design diagram, which means that you need a hypothesis. So since you're not really testing anything, I don't know if it's always the best project, but it would be a really interesting one if you could build a machine that would crush trash into smaller pieces that could be implemented before you even put them in landfills. So I know that was a lot on pollution, but there's a lot of project ideas there. We have acid rain. So acid rain is related to a lot of the things I was saying earlier and the pollutants that are happening with air pollution. Acid rain results when sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides, the thing I was mentioning earlier, oxides, are emitted into the atmosphere and transported by wind and air currents. They react with water and then fall down with the rain. Acid rain destroys a lot of natural habitats. It burns through plants. It burns through trees. It, as you can see from the picture, causes a lot of damage. The major sources of SO2 and nitrogen oxide is from burning of fossil fuels to generate electricity, vehicles and heavy equipment, and manufacturing. So really all of our factories and cars are causing this and putting this out. As always, there are problems with completely killing acid rain at the source, because in some ways we need cars and in some ways we need factories. But if there are ways to protect our environments from acid rains, that would be super helpful. So acid rain is inherently just acids. So acid is something on a pH scale. So the pH scale is a scale of how acidic something is. The smaller the number, the more acidic it is. The larger the number, the more basic it is. So because you have all of these very acidic acid rains, if you could find chemicals that we could spray into the air that are just basic, that'd be a really good way to neutralize it. A good way to test this would be if you had plants, maybe spraying some with some household cleaner and then spraying like vinegar and seeing what happens. Or you could just first off test how putting a basic layer, as in a basic, like basic as in on the pH scale, protectant, see how that would work. I need protectants that we could find. Maybe there's protectants in our daily life that you could put on foliage, that we could go around and cover some foliage and that would serve as a protectant layer, that the acid would burn through that protectant layer, but it wouldn't ever get to the foliage. So these are a lot of good experiments that you could work with plants that are pretty easy to do. They just take a lot of chemistry research and figuring out ways to neutralize acid. Another way is, as always, you can always figure out the timeline of things. And one is to measure the rate of decay. Take a bunch of plants, spray different amounts of vinegar on them, or lemon juice, anything that's acidic really, and measure how fast these things are decaying. Try to find something with a similar acidic level to these oxides that are being in the atmosphere. And it serves a really good project, because anytime you can give a number, a hard number for how much these things are going to decay, it really helps scientists and it creates a good project. Then we have oil spills. So I feel like most people know this. There are oil rigs out into the ocean, and sometimes these oil rigs have oil spills. They're never really caused on purpose, but oil is so damaging for the ocean. It just completely ruins coral. It kills and kills and kills marine life. It's one of the worst things that can happen to the ocean. There was this big oil spill, I think it was in 2006, and we're still fighting the effects from that oil spill today. And we can still visibly see the effects from that oil spill. And it's been over a decade. So I did a whole project on this, and I found it very interesting. So scientists have come up with 3 ways to prevent oil spills and to fight them, and that is something called sorbents and dispersants. So sorbents is kind of like a net. So if the oil's falling in the water, what if we had a net that could kind of protect the water by capturing all the oil before it even touches the water? So sorbents would need to be able to float on top of the water, and once the oil drops in it, people are able to fold up the sides of the sorbent, put it back on the boat, and minimal oil would end up in the ocean. So this is a great idea. There are 2 types, natural sorbents and synthetic sorbents, and there's a whole argument between them. So natural sorbents are good because a lot of them are reusable. A lot of them are very inexpensive, and we could use some of them. And they're the easiest to find. The problem with natural sorbents is no natural sorbent is going to fit perfectly like a glove. Like, there's always going to be pros and cons of every natural sorbent. You're never going to find a perfect one. Now, synthetic sorbents, you might be able to design the perfect one. Something that's oilific, which means oil loving, and hydrophilic, which means water hating, meaning it'll float on water, but then it will be attracted to the oil, so it'll soak it all up. So you could design the perfect one, but the problem is these are very expensive and very costly. So there's a whole debate going on. So maybe you're able, if you have some labs, to make some synthetic sorbents and then use some natural sorbents and can compare and contrast them. Or you could just get all natural sorbents and compare and contrast. You'd have to do a lot of research on looking into what properties different sorbents need, and then what materials that you can get very easily fit these. One I found that's really helpful is kapok fiber. You can get it for like $3 on Amazon in massive supply. It works really well. Another is dispersants, which is kind of what I was mentioning earlier with acid rain, which is putting chemicals that will neutralize oil. The problem is the original solution to oil spills was dispersants, but now we're seeing that there could be negative side effects, because anytime you put chemicals in nature, there will be some negative side effects. So scientists are hoping to move away from dispersants and move into sorbents, but you could still test dispersants in the kind of the same way that you tested acid rain, just figuring out ways to neutralize that reaction. Finally, ocean acidification. So ocean acidification impacts fish and seaweed. It's changes in ocean chemistry which can affect the behavior of organisms. It affects the ability of some fish to detect predators. And studies have shown that decreased pH levels also affect some fish's ability to locate suitable habitats. So it's an ongoing decrease in the pH of the Earth's oceans, which is caused by the uptake of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is a little bit more acidic, and that's causing the oceans to become more acidic. The big negative that this is causing is it's affecting our coral reefs. So again, like I mentioned with dispersants, you could find ways to neutralize these reactions. Or you could play a little bit of devil's advocate and test out all of these basic chemicals and see, oh, actually, here are the negative side effects. And you could make a whole project on advising scientists which chemicals they shouldn't use in these experiments because they have negative side effects. A fun one I've seen a lot of people do and get really unique with it is called coral protectants, which is applying layers to coral that could help prevent coral decay. So you'd have to do a lot of research into coral decay and what causes coral decay, and then talking about how we can protect from coral decay. Anyway, so I hope all of these give you a kind of idea of the environmental issues that we're facing here. A lot of them obviously are just caused by this massive increase in CO2. Most of these problems really could be fixed if we planted more trees we just need more trees. But if scientists need to be coming up with more ideas on how to fix some of the symptoms, because the root causes of a lot of these issues we're not realistically going to be able to fix right now. Unless everyone switches to electric cars or we completely go into renewable sources. That would be great, but I don't see that happening. So you just need to look into these environmental issues and find a way to think, what's something I can change? What's something I can test? If you want to test, what are the negatives of these things? How will these negative things, why we shouldn't use this certain chemical? Or if you want to figure out a timeline, that would also be helpful. Or if you just want to find a solution, that would all be helpful. Every time you're able to give researchers real world application through your experiments, you're going to go far with your experiments. The best experiments have real world implications. So what we can do as STEM for Tomorrow is guide you guys and try to give you these ideas and spark some passion for helping change and fixing these environmental problems. And what you can do is just keep thinking and taking all of this background we got yesterday in ecology and some of the cycles I spoke on today to help come up with science fair projects to some of these issues. So that I'm going to open the floor for the next 8 minutes for questions from you guys. Why can't we just add salt to the oceans to fight acidification? Acidification is more caused by a difference in pH levels. So it's not really caused by a complete depletion in the salt in the oceans. There's still salt in the oceans. It's just we need to find a way to fix the CO2 levels, which will fix the acidification. The best ways to fix it is by reducing factories. Right now, we need to come up with ways to fix the symptoms. That was a long explanation. What was that orange-colored pollutant called? The orange-colored one, I think I was talking about, was oxides. Yes, I was talking about oxides, which is the ones that end up in the air and cause acid rain. Could another way of battling oil spills be engineering better ships? That is a really good idea. A way to engineer it so that there wouldn't be oil spills. I think oil spills are inevitable. They'll always happen, but it's a good idea. Maybe make little model ships. Here's a better design for them. Anyway, any more questions? Okay, any last questions? Can I repeat what I said about the research idea about lichen? Yes. So Lichen is really sensitive to the air and really reacts with the air a lot. So lichen is a really good indicator for how the rest of the environment will react to changes in uh, pollutants or changes in the air. So a really good science fair experiment would be to take lichen and expose it to the different chemicals or simulations of chemicals that we're seeing in the air today. So that's just a little one idea. You could tweak that out. Something I was thinking about. Okay. If that is all, then I hope this inspired any of you to think of new ideas, and I hope that you have more of a background in biology and ecology now. Thank you all for coming so much. I think we're going to wrap it up a couple minutes early then. Bye, everyone.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.